Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 11th of July 2011, the podcast that takes a licking and keeps on nitpicking. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's do a flyover of the news of the bogus. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has acknowledged that a missile has accidentally hit a civilian home in a working-class neighborhood in Libya. According to reporters and Libyan officials, there were 9 deaths, including a child and a baby. The reaction from Libyan officials is exactly what you'd think it would be. Libyan Foreign Minister Abdulhadi al-Abadi called, quote, for all Muslims to initiate a global jihad against the oppressive criminal West. This from a country we had been allied with against terrorists for many years. Can there be any more denying that our interventionist foreign policy just generates blowback and creates more terrorists? This was a working class area. There were no military installations anywhere near there. As mistakes go, this is a big one. But even if NATO forces didn't intend to bomb a civilian area, it doesn't matter. Intentions do not matter. Only actions and consequences. And this sort of thing happens in every single war. Innocent civilians are killed, either deliberately or accidentally, and are just shrugged off as collateral damage. If you or I take an action that results in the death of innocent people, even if we intended no harm, we can be prosecuted and put in prison for it. Yet year after year, our government continues to do things which would be serious crimes if you or I did them, and writes them off with a bit of newspeak. They say collateral damage is inevitable in war. I say that's one more reason why we shouldn't be at war with anybody. Unless we're attacked or invaded, we have no business sending our military around the world to destroy monsters, because innocent people will be killed and more monsters created in the process. That may sound great to the government and to the military-industrial complex, but it's disastrous to people around the world as well as to you and me. It was a Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned us of this in his farewell address. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. When you leave the restroom, or get off the exercise equipment, or put away a shopping cart, do you douse your hands with antibacterial hand sanitizer? Have you been sick this year? If you answered yes to both questions, the incidents may not be unrelated, according to a guest blog on Scientific American. The antibacterial soaps, wipes, and hand sanitizers usually contain either triclosan or triclocarbon. And they aren't the only ones. Triclosan is being added to cutting boards, refrigerators, lunchboxes, and anywhere else we're afraid of the invisible menace. The problem is, all of this just may be making us sicker. There are a lot of problems, the first being that they just don't seem to be working. According to a study done at the University of Michigan, there wasn't any evidence that antibacterial soap gave you any greater protection from gastrointestinal illnesses than regular soap. In fact, they found a slight effect in the other direction. Another study at Columbia University found that, although there was no difference among healthy people, for people with chronic illnesses such as diabetes and asthma, antibiotic soaps actually increase the chance of getting sick. This seems counterintuitive until you understand one fact. Our skin is covered with bacteria all the time, and most of it is good bacteria. Not only does it help keep our skin clean, consuming the oils our body produces, they also protect us from invaders from beyond, bacterial invaders that may cause us harm if they infect us. The article refers to these bacteria as tourists, as opposed to the native bacteria that inhabits our skin the whole time. The problem is, antimicrobial soap and hand sanitizers have no way of distinguishing the good bacteria from the bad, so they may be effective at killing the tourists, but at the same time, they kill your native bacteria, leaving you with lowered defenses. It's kind of like stopping an invading army by bombing your own fort. Now, since there was no difference among healthy people, it may be that our natural defensive flora can regroup and, to coin a proverb, increase and multiply, shoring up our defenses relatively quickly. But an already sick body may have trouble doing this. The tourists might get a foothold, and there goes the neighborhood. There's another problem as well. You see it on the label. Kills 99.9% of bacteria. And if you're at all clever, this immediately leads you to think, what about that other 0.1%? Those are stronger germs that you're actually giving your hands a selective pressure to favor. Not only that, but some of these stronger germs actually consume triclosan, which means you're feeding them as well. So what's the solution? Just wash your hands with regular old soap and water. You'll wash off the germs that haven't been established, but your native flora have set up shop in your pores and will be unharmed in the process. What does it say that our society looks for the sciencey high-tech solution that doesn't work and may even be more harmful when a cheap, easy, centuries-old method works just fine? 5 years ago, Congress passed a law mandating enrollment into 401k programs for employees, but according to the Employee Benefit Research Institute, it's actually having the opposite effect. Less money is saved in 401k accounts than if people had been allowed to save voluntarily. What a surprise. It has, on the one hand, increased the number of people saving, but it's decreased the rate at which they save. The reason why is, when employees set their own contributions, they usually set it between 5 and 10%. But the automatic enrollment is usually 3% or even less. And although employees can raise that level if they want, since they're being automatically signed up, most of them don't bother. It goes from being a priority to something they'll do later, and may not get to. Overall, the average contribution rate declined from 7.9% of income before the law to 7.3% last year. Employees may eventually raise their contribution rates, but according to the research, 15 to 25% of them are unlikely to ever catch up. And that's bad news not only for their futures, but for our economy as well. Government, will you please stop trying to fix things? And now it's time to wonder at the wantonness of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. What's really interesting to find is an article that is filled with good information and commits bogosity at the same time. I don't mean some of the points are good and others are bogus. All of the points are good, but presented in a bogus way. Case in point, an article on truthout.org by Dr. Cynthia Boaz, who is also a regular contributor to that respected and esteemed news site, The Huffington Post. The article is a very good summary of the propaganda techniques that the news media employs to manipulate the viewers. That's the good part. The bogus part is that they, quite rightly, accuse Fox News of using these tactics, while they, quite wrongly, ignore the fact that most other media outlets do this too. We'll cover the first few to get the idea. Their first example is panic-mongering. This is the use of fear-mongering to keep people afraid at every moment. They accuse Fox News of doing this with everything from Muslims to immigrants. But what about other news channels that create panic of default and widespread economic Armageddon if the debt ceiling isn't raised? Or people starving in the streets if the Bush tax cuts, which aren't really tax cuts and many were Obama's anyway, aren't removed? Try tuning into one news outlet that doesn't constantly assault you with reasons to be panicky and afraid. The second is character assassination and ad hominem attacks. They attack Fox News for vilifying people by calling them liberals and progressives. Wait, I thought those were supposed to be good things according to the left. But not only do the other news outlets do this, there are far more egregious examples than what this article gives. This podcast covered one example back on April 18th, when we gave Rachel Maddow biggest Bogon emitter for comparing people who were in favor of enforcing the 10th Amendment of the Constitution as being like pro-slavery secessionists, and for being racist since they disagreed with Obama. Hardly the only time they've done that. The third is projection and flipping, where one side accuses the other of something they do themselves. Isn't this very article an example of that? And the fourth, rewriting history, is a laugh, considering that very same Rachel Maddow screed, where people in favor of state nullification, a tactic used by northern states against slavery, was rewritten as being associated with the pro-slavery and anti-nullification South. You can go down their long list doing this time and time again, scapegoating, conflating violence with power, bullying, confusion, populism. And the sad thing is, the only two commentators I know of who don't do this are John Stossel and Judge Andrew Napolitano, and they're both on Fox! This is what dogmatism does. It's removing the speck from someone else's eye without removing the plank from your own. And to do so in such a brazen and shameless and public fashion will very quickly get you named this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to take down a peg the ego of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. The news, the social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and the blog sphere have all risen in fury over the jury finding Casey Anthony not guilty of murdering her 2-year-old daughter. The uproar has been unavoidable. Everywhere you turn, people are expressing outrage, wondering how the jury could possibly have found her not guilty. How stupid could they be? She totally killed her baby, and you're just gonna let her go? Out of 300 million Americans, apparently there are only 12 who couldn't see the obvious and undeniable truth. It's just too bad they happen to be the ones on the jury. Here's the most important thing that can be said about the case. I don't know if Casey Anthony murdered her daughter. And neither do you. According to the prosecution, Casey killed her daughter with chloroform, bound her in duct tape, and dumped her body in the woods. According to the defense, Casey's daughter drowned accidentally in their pool, and Casey's father, George, panicked, perhaps in fear of being charged with negligent homicide, and hid her body in the woods. Casey was found guilty of the cover-up, but not the other charges. Here's how this works. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. You cannot deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property unless you prove your case. That consists not only of providing enough evidence to support your version of events, but also providing enough evidence to rule out the alternatives. Quite simply, the prosecution failed. They claimed Casey had hid her daughter in the trunk, but there was no DNA evidence to corroborate this, nor were there signs of chloroform or of decomposition. They were unable to pinpoint a cause of death, so not only could they not prove the death by chloroform, they couldn't rule out the drowning either. In truth, the prosecutors spent more time talking to the media, trying their case in the court of public opinion, with much greater success. But then, the court of public opinion doesn't go by the rules of evidence. Really, the only thing they had on her was the cover-up, which the defense didn't even deny. The prosecution presented no evidence to show that Casey was a bad mother or a negligent mother, but of course people are pointing to this as evidence of her guilt. But it just isn't. If you're accused of a crime and you're innocent, why would you cover it up? Why shouldn't you be upfront and straightforward with the police about everything? All other reasons aside, one stands out. Because there is all the difference in the world between being innocent and being able to explain everything that happened. How do you really think you'd match up against a skilled interrogator whose wits and ability to manipulate words have been honed over many years of experience? If you're ever questioned by the police, the FBI, the IRS, or anyone else, be sure not to say one word without your lawyer present. Don't think that just because you're innocent you'll be able to handle yourself. We'd hate to lose a listener. That's what Casey should have done. She didn't. She lied and paid the price for it. But you can't go from a panicked cover-up to murder without other evidence to back it up. And that evidence was severely lacking. The prosecution also painted a picture of a woman who partied and was clearly not grieving. Lots of pundits, both in the news media and online, hailed this over and over again as evidence of her guilt. Okay, that's evidence of an unfeeling person, possibly with a psychological disorder, but there's a wide gulf between that and murder. The truth is, the people screaming out the loudest against the verdict are people who have no respect for the rules of evidence. These rules were slowly developed over centuries of English common law, and as a result, citizens have far greater protection than ever against lynch mobs and overzealous government prosecutors. These rules are not there to protect the guilty. They are to protect innocent citizens like you and me. Anyone innocent of a crime would be powerless to defend themselves without these protections. These protections are far more important than the outcome of any individual case. Thanks to organizations like the Innocence Project, over 260 people convicted of serious crimes have been found innocent by DNA testing, and 25% of those were murder cases. It's clear that even the protections we have are not enough, and still, people complain about the system, saying it's too easy for guilty people to go free. or at least people that they, in their perceived omniscience, think are guilty. They don't agree with the adage that it's better to let guilty people go free than for innocent people to go to prison. But here's what they don't understand. If you have a murder and an innocent person gets convicted, then the murderer still has gone free. So you go from a system where a murderer goes free to one where a murderer goes free and an innocent person goes to prison. How could that possibly be better? The only exception to this would be the case where the murder wasn't a murder at all, say an accident, in which case no murderer will go free because there is no murderer. Their position just cannot be defended on any logical or moral grounds. And yet, that attitude pervades. There were no eyewitnesses to say what happened to Caylee Anthony. But even if there were, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. According to the Innocence Project, 75% of wrongful convictions happen, at least in part, because of faulty eyewitness testimony, even when the eyewitnesses are 100% sure of what they saw. The forensic evidence in this case was lacking and inconclusive. But even with the best forensic evidence, there are still problems. Forensic investigators work for the state, and therefore have the bias and incentive to conclude what the state wants them to. They do not repeat their studies, nor do they submit their findings for peer review. Very little in forensics has been based on solid fundamental scientific investigation. It's been mostly built up case by case, as forensic examiners try new techniques to determine what happened. They do not conform to basic scientific standards for accuracy and quality assurance. And even in cases where the science is sound, the forensic evidence is presented to the jury as being far more precise than it really is. Any scientist will tell you not to trust a scientific paper that doesn't show error bars. In trials, the forensic experts rarely even admit that there is a margin for error. For example, according to the Innocence Project, Alejandro Dominguez is one of those convicted of a crime he didn't commit and later cleared by DNA evidence. At his trial, the jury was told that his blood was a perfect match to the blood on the scene, without telling them that 2/3 of Americans would also have matched that sample. Even DNA evidence itself can be problematic. How good of a match it is depends on how many markers are checked, but it's never a 100% match, yet a single marker out of place is enough to invalidate the entire match and show that the example must be from a different person. But overzealous prosecutors will often consider such a result as close enough and present it to the jury as if it's a complete match. DNA is much more effective at exonerating a defendant than condemning him, but you'll never hear that from prosecutors. It's clear that we need to be highly skeptical of evidence of someone's guilt, even at the best of times, and this case was far from the best of times. Maybe Caylee Anthony did murder her daughter. And maybe the 12 jurors believed that she murdered her. But they aren't supposed to go on their beliefs. They aren't supposed to conform to mob mentality, or follow the media hype, or even follow their own emotions, outrage at the mother, and sympathy for the daughter. They're supposed to go by the evidence, and the evidence just wasn't there, at least not enough to get past reasonable doubt. And if you don't agree with that, if you consider yourself so omnipotent that you know more about what was going on than people who examined all of the relevant evidence directly, if, even after hearing all of this, you still insist that Caylee Anthony must be guilty, then you need to pencil in your name next to this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! Well, that wraps up this proctorial edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from the TV show Boston Legal. She's cold, materialistic, unlikable, and it might bring you all pleasure to see her go to jail. But as for evidence to establish that she committed a murder beyond all reasonable doubt, it just isn't there. The only possible route to a guilty verdict here is schadenfreude. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Imported License. Bogosity.